Structured observation is a form of observational measurement that is probably used more than the other two forms of observation in HDFS. In structured observation, the scientist works to create the environment. They structure it in some way. The reason they do that is so that every subject is exposed to the exact same environmental conditions. This makes it less natural, but it also makes it more efficient, essentially. Let me illustrate with some examples. Very famously in the field of HDFS is the strange situation developed by Mary Ainsworth back in 1970. She calls it the strange situation. Perhaps a better name would be the unfamiliar situation. You create an environment that is unfamiliar to the child, and that environment is identical for every child who is a subject of this study. Essentially, there are 8 episodes. They are timed down to the second. I've conducted strange situations. You can't do this without a stopwatch. The things are structured to that extent that the timing of it is down to the second, and you need a stopwatch. So essentially, you have an episode where a caregiver, in this case, a mother, brings the child into that strange situation, and the child gets acclimated to the toys that are there, and then after a specified amount of time, a stranger comes in and sits in the chair as you see pictured here. Then after a specified amount of time, the stranger gets on the floor and starts interacting with the child, and essentially you're trying to kind of increase the strangeness of the experience for the child. You want him or her to be a little stressed, because you want to see how they use their caregiver when they're a little stressed. So the observation is structured specifically in order to gradually escalate the anxiety for a small child. Pretty soon the mother leaves the room and the baby is there with a stranger. After a certain amount of time, the mother comes back into the room, and we carefully observe what kind of interactions happen on that. It's called the first reunion. Then the mother leaves again, and the stranger leaves, so that the baby is left alone, and that is presumably the most stressful situation for the baby to be in. And then after a certain amount of time, the mother returns, and again we observe carefully what behaviors we see during that second reunion. This is a strange situation. It's probably the most famous structured observation in our field, but we use a lot of structured observations specifically to study young children. Another famous one, published in 1960, is the so-called visual cliff, and developmental scientists are still using versions of the visual cliff. In this case, there is a sheet of plexiglass across the top, so that baby is not about to fall, but an illusion has been created with that patterned paper, so that visually it might look to the baby as if there's a drop-off. And this can be used to measure things like depth perception. Can a baby perceive that there is a drop-off there? And at what age do they learn it's not safe for them to continue to crawl or walk across that visual cliff? In this moment that's been captured in this picture, the mother is on one side sort of encouraging the baby to come to her, and so she's forcing him to make a decision about what he thinks is safe or not. So those are some very famous vintage structured observations that are still widely used to study things. Currently, violation of expectation tasks are very, very popular in HDFS to study infants. Violation of expectation is when we do something that the baby would not expect. It violates their expectations, and then we carefully observe how they react to it. So typically we are observing their little eyeballs and what they are looking at. In this case, they show them an event on video where you can see a woman. It looks like she's folding clothes. A little bit later in the video, it's labeled there, baby begins to cry. So there's a baby in the bassinet off to the right of the screen, and the baby starts to cry. And then the third screen capture, you can see the woman appears to be walking in that direction. And in the final panel, you see that the woman is comforting the crying baby. In another video episode, it's very similar, but the woman is folding clothes. The baby begins to cry. She walks in that direction, but instead of attending and comforting the baby, she ignores the crying baby in the bassinet and instead tends to the laundry basket, which is right there. So these are two events that we might show an infant in order that we have structured this observation, but we want to observe how does the baby react to these things. And there is an assumption that babies will look for a long time at something if it doesn't make sense, very much the way adults look at things a little harder when it doesn't quite make sense. Our we'll glance at something if it all seems to be in order, but if something seems to be off, we stop and take a look at it longer. The assumption is that babies do the same thing. So even though we can't ask a very small baby, what do you think is normal, we can infer what's going on in their mind by the way they look at either the first or the second video. And what you see here with 4-month-old babies is that the white bar shows how long they spend looking at the adult comforting the baby, and you can see that they spend less time in the crying when the baby is crying. They spend less time looking at the comforting event, presumably because that seems normal. It seems to them that that's what an adult should do when a baby is crying, and they spend more time looking if the baby has started crying and the adult ignores the baby. And this is presumably, notice on the right, instead of the baby in the bassinet crying, the baby in the bassinet laughs. And they're not terribly surprised that parents ignore that, and they're not terribly surprised that parents comfort that. Neither one of those seemed very different to them. But when the baby's crying, it seems like even a 4-month-old kind of expects some sort of comfort. And so when comfort doesn't come, they look at that situation a little bit longer. Structured observations allow us this insight into the minds of small children who wouldn't otherwise be able to tell us what's going on. And perhaps for this reason, they're used quite a lot. They tend to be very narrowly structured, perhaps even more narrowly structured than naturalistic observation. And I say more narrowly structured because the test has been created specifically to look for one very specific thing. Again, it is something that is observable in objective reality. We're not able to get into subjective reality and what people are thinking and feeling, but we might get some insights about that by watching their objective behavior. But again, we're only watching their objective behavior. Just like naturalistic observation, structured observation is more objective than self-report. But to contrast it with naturalistic observation a little bit, it's more efficient. We no longer have that problem of extraneous variables that aren't controlled. In the strange situation, for instance, every toy is exactly the same in every strange situation. So it's not that maybe there's a toy that captures the child's attention in one instance, but that toy isn't present in the other. No, even the toys are identical. We know that every child will have an opportunity to demonstrate a reunion because we've created a separation, so that there must be a reunion. So it's going to be efficient. A strange situation only takes about 22 minutes. So in 22 minutes time, we get to see 2 separations and reunions because we have built them in, we've structured it, we've created them, and that is efficient. That means that samples can get larger because we can study more babies, because each one only takes 22 minutes, you see. And so that efficiency allows sample sizes to get larger. And the structure also creates measurement reliability. We know that the measures are working pretty much the same way all the time because they're very, very standardized. Now, as always with observation, there are these 2 limitations, reactivity and observer bias, and they're dealt with in very much the same way they were for naturalistic observation. For reactivity, we allow warm-up periods, and for observation bias, to get rid of observer bias, we focus on training and practice, kind of reliability training among the observers. But specific to structured observation is the problem that because we have created standardized environments, we may have created environments that are not typical or usual or normal, and so they lack ecological validity, and kids may be reacting to the fact that the environment is strange and bizarre, and so we may not be able to measure the things that we're trying to measure. With the violation of expectations example, for instance, watching an interaction happening on a videotape, that might be fine for babies for whom there is television in their home and they see these kinds of things as part of their daily life. But that is not all babies. Not all babies are exposed to videos, and it's possible that we've lost the ecological validity. The baby may be unfamiliar with the media, the mechanism used for the measurement, and therefore you won't get an honest answer. So that's kind of the downside. But structured observations are used a lot, especially in the study of child development.